Hello everyone, in this video we're going to be going through seasonality and variation in demand in the context of capacity management in operations management. We're going to start by having a flashback to the 4 V's, which is the way that we describe an operation. So the 4 V's are volume, variety, variation, demand, and visibility. And if you understand each of these 4 elements, you've got a pretty good understanding of your operation as a whole. The one that's important to us for this topic is very much variation in demand. So if we understand the variation in demand that our operation is dealing with, that really sets us on the path to developing an appropriate capacity management plan. Variation in demand doesn't relate to any kind of variation with your products or services that you're producing. That would be variety. Variation in demand relates to the difference in demand levels or demand types that occur within your market. So different levels of demand from your customers, either in share volume or in the type of demand for the different types of products and services you offer. We have 4 different possible sources of variation in demand or expressions of variation in demand, of which we're most interested in seasonal, but there is good reason for that. So the first we can discuss is trend. If you have different trends, then those are long-term permanent changes in variation that will play out typically over a long time frame. So the shift from physical books towards ebooks is a general trend in the market. So if you're a book publisher like Harper's or Penguin, you are still selling physical books, but the demand for books is switching away from your physical book and towards an ebook. So that's something which is important, but that's also a strategic shift, is also something which involves many other parts of the organization. So we're not going to tackle trends and variation in trends when it comes to capacity management. Irregular variation in demand is also something which is difficult to tackle because by definition it's not predictable. So a very irregular demand may be irregular variation may be a consequence of external shifts, which then have a knock-on effect on your operation. So if you're a town, or you're even a business within a town, let's say a business within the hospitality sector, you run a hotel, and the Conservative Party conference comes to your town that particular year. That's going to lead to a sharp uptick in demand, but it's irregular. It's not going to reoccur soon, and if it does reoccur, it's not going to reoccur on a set pattern. It's going to reoccur because they again really liked your town and wanted to come back to your town, but again, it's not something you can plan for or develop some kind of management strategy for. Random variations in demand are also impossible to plan for because by definition they are unpredictable. Sometimes you simply don't know why there's a variation in demand. You don't know why suddenly customers are demanding a particular type of product for a particular time frame, and therefore it's very difficult for us to try and plan or identify these. So what we want to do then is really zero in on seasonal demand. So this is a variation which is not necessarily connected to the seasons, but rather is a cycle. So it's predictable. We have an understanding of when seasonal variation is going to occur. We have an understanding of the type of variation that will occur when it does, and we understand that it's going to come in cycles. Is not going to be a one-off spike or a one-off dip, but it is going to reoccur again and again. So seasonal variations need to be identified and planned for. Otherwise, you run the risk of really being unable to effectively manage your capacity, when actually, if you had sat down and developed a capacity management plan, you'd be able to far more efficiently make use of your resources. We have 6 underlying causes of seasonality that we're going to look at turn by turn, which cover most, if not all, of the potential predictable cycles of variation in demand that we need to be aware of in order to manage within an operation. So the first is probably the one that seems the most obvious. It's climatic. So an issue with the climate which causes a predictable cycle of variation. And this obviously will vary depending on the kind of operation you're dealing with, but some very obvious examples come to mind. If you're producing swimwear or beachwear, then you're going to have much greater demand during warm weather. And since warm weather tends to occur during the summer and early autumn months, you have a good idea of the predictable cycle that occurs. Greater demand during the warm months and then lower demand in the cold months. Similarly, if you're selling umbrellas, you're going to have greater demand during the rainy season and less demand during the quiet season. So climate itself can be quite a major cause of seasonality, and it doesn't just affect the obvious products and services that directly relate to activities that can only be done in a particular climate. It can also have an unusual impact on other products and services as well. For example, say you run a store in a high street or a town centre selling greeting cards, birthday cards, wedding cards and the like. And you may say, well, we're not really impacted by the weather. People don't buy more greeting cards because the weather's good, or buy less greeting card because the weather's good. However, if the climate will influence, a much greater footfall through your high street or your town centre, then the greater number of consumers walking past your store will usually result in a high number of sales, simply because people will walk past the store and decide on a whim perhaps to purchase a card. So it may not be the most important driver of seasonality for somewhere like a greeting card store. It is a contributing cause of seasonality nonetheless. Talking about a greeting card company, it's likely that one of the key sources of seasonality will actually be festive causes. So this is any kind of festival, whether that's Christmas, Diwali, Eid, religious or secular, any kind of festival which causes spikes or changes in demand. So a greeting card company likely sees much higher demand during the Christmas period, for example, in the run-up to Christmas in particular, as people go and purchase greeting cards to send to relatives, friends, and so on for Christmas. Similarly, if you're an Easter egg company, you're going to have huge spikes in demand in the run-up to Easter, and then likely a sharp drop-off for the rest of the year. So any kind of festival will likely have particular impacts. And we have a similar thing here as with the climate as well. Sometimes you'll see unusual connections because it has knock-on effects. So in the run-up to Christmas, people are also generally shopping for gifts. They also tend to be in town centres. I mean, this is all presuming the world's going to go back to normal after the coronavirus crisis. But any kind of increase in footfall will also have a knock-on effect. So if you're a restaurant or you're a fast food store, a chicken and chip shop, you may think, well, Christmas doesn't affect us. But if it increases the number of people walking past your store, that's likely to have a subsequent increase in your business as well. So it can either be a primary cause of seasonality or it can be a secondary cause of seasonality. The third cause is behavioural, And this isn't necessarily connected to a specific event or a specific item. It could just be the behavioral norms within your target market. Coffee is always a good example. Sometimes, in some cultures, coffee tends to be a morning drink. So, if you're from Western Europe, for example, coffee stores will have their highest demand in the morning period as people wake up, go to work, go to school, and stop to buy a cup of coffee. However, in other cultures, so Turkish and Mediterranean cultures, it tends to be an evening drink also, that people will have a cup of coffee after a meal or with friends just in the evening time. So that's not specifically because of the climate, it's not necessarily because of any festive occasion, it's just a behavioral pattern which affected companies have to track and therefore manage their capacity around. The fourth cause is political, and this might sound odd when you were talking about things like greeting card stores, but political events can also represent a source of predictable cycles of demand. So if you think about any kind of news media, when there's a major political event happening or there's a run up to a major political event, consumption of news media is going to go much higher, and therefore demand is going, that is demand increasing for that particular product. An election is always a good example of this. In the run up to elections, people do pay more attention to the news, and therefore they'll consume more newspapers, visit more news websites, or watch televised news in greater numbers. So that kind of predictable cycle will lead to predictable cycles of demand as well. And if you have your product or service directly impacted, that's going to be a key driver of your capacity management plan. On a similar note, financial and economic cycles can produce predictable spikes and troughs in demand as well. So the classic example of financial factors driving a predictable cycle of demand would be accountants. So in the run up to the end of the financial year, where tax returns are due, demand for accountants will go up. And therefore, if you're an accounting firm, you have to manage your resources accordingly. As well as this, you would also see the demand for products and services which serve a distinct and well understood purpose for reducing tax or benefit in arranging tax affairs. The demand for that will also go up fairly high as well. Those will be direct drivers for cycles of demand, but you also have indirect effects as well. This isn't necessarily very prevalent in countries in Europe, and particularly Western Europe, where tax tends to be taken at source. So if you work in the UK, for example, there's a very high likelihood that you don't directly pay either national insurance or you don't directly pay your income tax. Instead, your employer will pay for you. So you receive your salary post-tax rather than pre-tax. In this case, it's relatively rare or unusual to get a substantial windfall in the form of a tax rebate or a overpaid tax. However, in other countries, particularly say the United States, where this far more common for tax to be paid by the individual, and here we see a slight but distinct predictable cycle of demand, where particular goods and services will see a spike in demand around the time where tax is taken for the year, tax returns are filed, but also you see tax rebates and returns being paid out from the government to individuals. And that tends to be items where people will buy for necessity, but not necessarily in an emergency. So home improvements as well as things like TVs see a distinct noticeable bump as a large number of people receive a financial windfall, and therefore there's relatively predictable things that large numbers of people will go out and buy, and apparently nice TVs is one of them. Something which people will wait until they get the tax rebate, get some additional windfall, and then go spend money on TVs. The last source or cause of these seasonality we're going to look at is social causes, and this can be broken down to a few different categories. The two major ones would be social norms, and the other one would be social taboos. Ramadan, the Muslim month of fasting, is a good example of social causes of seasonality in both respects. So the demand in areas with a large Muslim population for sweet goods and desserts tends to rise, as well as other foodstuffs, because of the social norm for hosting gatherings to break the fast in the evening. So that does tend to rise quite sharply. That's not necessarily a festival, but it is certainly a social period, a period where social norms will see sharp increases for demand of certain items. But also simultaneously we see social taboo against public eating during Ramadan. Even if you're not fasting, there's a social taboo against eating publicly and visibly. So demand for eating in restaurants will significantly reduce if there is a large Muslim population, and if you're talking about an overwhelmingly Muslim population, the demand for public eating in restaurants, for example, may go down to levels where restaurants will simply close during daylight hours altogether. So both social norms, so expected norms of behavior influenced by society, as well as social taboos, can really drive particular predictable variations in demand and be a cause of seasonality. Those categories are fairly broad, but they do cover a large portion of what drives predictable variations. We've said this before, but I just want to highlight again how seasonality in this context simply means a predictable cycle. It doesn't necessarily mean a cycle connected to the calendar year. It doesn't necessarily mean the change from spring to summer, to autumn to winter. Seasonality could refer to a predictable cycle within a single day, such as the cycle when it comes to restaurants or places serving coffee, or it could be a multi-year cycle also. But what that does give us is an ability to develop a outline of our demand variations over a set period. We're able to see a representation of how our demand should fluctuate throughout the year. So this is forecasted demand. There may be multiple causes impacting that cycle at the same time. So there may be distinct climate related, festival related, as well as social or behavioural related causes for seasonality in your particular operation, but it should output into a graph akin to this. So all of these actually happen to be over a calendar year, but again, that's not necessary. You could develop one of these quite easily for a single day as well if you have significant predictable cycles of demand, from the morning to the afternoon to the evening. But it allows us to map how demand should look like at various points in time. And this is very much the first part of us being able to manage capacity, is by identifying our cycle of demand and identifying our forecasted demand.